Now, these are just a few snapshots of the victories that citizens have registered. The National Clearinghouse on Hazardous Waste, Lois Gibbs from Love Canal in New York. "6,000 groups belong to her clearinghouse. She started it from her own sheer energy, virtually no money, determination, connecting all over the country. And what are those groups involved in? They're trying to suppress the silent cumulative violence that we too charitably call pollution in their neighborhoods and in their schools and in the water that they drink and what their children are exposed to." It is interesting that almost none of these civic victories get on the mass media. And why don't they get on the mass media? Why is the mass media so completely obsessed with stories that spell violence, sex, and addiction? Why are they so obsessed with flooding the public airways with overwhelming amounts of ever more tawdry and cheap entertainment, laced by massive amounts of advertising, greasing their corporate profit wheels? Have they ever heard of real news? News that tackles real-life problems? Have they ever heard of what it means for people struggling in their community to get a little attention, to get a little support by being on radio, being on TV? You know what you have to do in America today to get on those daytime talk shows? You got to be a freak or a weirdo. You got to be somebody who's semi-depraved and willing to be exploited. You got to be people who are down and out on their luck. You got to be people who are, in so many ways, utilized by those executives at the top of those corporate media corporations for maximizing their profits, while these people are goaded in between commercial breaks, etc., to rage against each other, spat against each other, swear against each other. And this is on our property, the public airways. Indeed, you can't even get a medical malpractice program on the Jenny Jones, Ricky Lake, Jerry Springer, Sally Jesse Raphael, and other shows. Not even something as gripping with human interest and people who have been done in by incompetent hospitals or negligent physicians. You can't even get that on anymore. You can't get it on. But male strippers who once committed incest are on their way to the seminary. They're on. And Sally Jesse, who once had a mind of her own on radio talk show, now rationalizes all these shows. And if I ever read the titles, even you wouldn't believe how bad it has become, and you are not innocent in observing the decay of our culture. And here is what she says. She says, those are morality plays. That's how she justifies getting it on. They're morality plays, you know. She's just watching them go at each other. In the meantime, anything dealing with big business, workplace issues, or corporate crime, they don't get on. And I'll get to that in a moment. But we've got to become far more demanding on how our public property, we are the landlords of the public airways, the broadcasters are the tenants, they pay us no rent, they decide who says what 24 hours a day, and they laugh all the way to the bank. And therefore, anything that really builds a solid, just society doesn't qualify to get on our very own property. Now, any knowledge of history registers this observation. Any society that allows one segment of it to have an excessive concentration of power and wealth And that segment has a commercial, mercantile priority above every other value system in the society is going to get in trouble. And we have, from time to time, as a society, fought back against the big robber barons and the railroads and the banks and the financial and natural resource companies, etc. But in the last 20 years, we have had an extraordinary concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer global corporation hands. And you can see the consequences of that in so many ways. When you have that kind of concentration of power and wealth, you have a weakened democracy. You have a weakened public voice. You have a weakened public advocacy. And that registers. And look how it's registered. Look at the signs of decline in this country because our democracy has not been allowed to strengthen itself, because we don't spend enough time as public citizens, because we have allowed global corporations with no allegiance to our country scour the globe for the dictatorships and the dirt-cheap labor to exploit and export the jobs there. We have allowed them to take over our government, to dominate our economy, to exploit small business, to straitjacket inventors, to shape our very culture, to replace our folk culture with commercial culture that stresses violence and addiction, to decide what kind of research is done at our universities, to decide that the ordinary people pay the taxes. As someone once said, only the little people pay taxes. To decide that they, the corporations, weren't going to pay any taxes. And now look at the result. In the 1950s, corporate income tax represented between 25 and 30% of the federal outlays. Today, it's between 6 and 8%. Record corporate profits, record stock market prices, record executive compensation, and they are paying a shrinking amount. And many of these giant corporations pay 1% federal tax, 2% federal tax. How about this one? Everybody watching this assembly, whoever paid $1 to Uncle Sam between the years 1981 and 1983, paid more taxes than the giant General Electric Company, which produced $6.5 billion in profits, paid no taxes because of a safe harbor loophole provision, got a $150 million refund, and that was supposed to be to get General Electric to invest in new productive capital equipment. Instead, they bought RCA, NBC, and now maybe you wonder why NBC isn't covering the close down of 4 nuclear plants in Connecticut, 3 of which are closed down due to safety defects this summer. Well, General Electric's in the nuclear business. What do you expect? Now, Thank you. Okay. The intonation should be, go, we go. Go, we go. All right. Now, for all those super rich Pollyannas who think America is #1, look what they and their corporate cohorts have done to America to make it far less than #1. In 1980, the U.S. was first in wages in the world. It's now 11th and sinking. In 1980, the U.S. was the greatest creditor in the world. It's now the biggest debtor in the world. Today, we're 17th in the world in infant mortality. We have 23% child poverty. Think about that. Almost 1 out of every 4 children in America live in dire poverty, with all that means in terms of stunted human potential, health hazards, safety hazards, brutalization, and surroundings that you wouldn't want to have to describe with any equanimity. You know what the child poverty rate is in the Netherlands and Sweden? 3% in Netherlands, 2% Sweden. We're the only country industrialized in the world that doesn't have universal health insurance. Over 40 million. Over 40 million Americans, many of them children, have no health insurance. 20 million are underinsured, and the rest wonder when they're going to fall through the cracks when they change jobs, pre-existing conditions, co-payments, deductibles, exclusions, cancellations. Hey, this is the land of the free, home of the brave. What gives? The GNP is up. 80% of the American people have suffered a decline in income and wealth adjusted for inflation in the last 20 years. 1% of the richest people have taken 2/3 of the financial wealth increase in the 1980s. 1%. The wealth of 90% of the American people barely is equal to the wealth of the top 2%, even the 1%, depending on which figures you rely on. Imagine. That kind of concentration of wealth is greater than any country in Western Europe, greater than in Japan. We now have the greatest disparity in wealth and income between the rich and the rest of the American people of any country in the Western industrialized world. And we used to have the least inequality because Europe was so class stratified with their barons, etc. Imagine the decline. The hunger in this country, while the taxpayers are forced to pay the Cargills and the Continental Grains to store all that food that's rotting in the warehouses. And just imagine, corporations are contributing 50% less to private pensions and workers who are lucky enough to have private pensions. And it keeps getting worse. Homelessness is up. You know, some of you who went abroad years ago came back to the U.S. and said, am I glad I'm back in the USA? And someone would say, why? Well, you say, you know, people there are afraid to drink the water. They got to have bottled water. It's, you know, you got the poor there, they're buying lottery tickets. Can you imagine? They hardly have enough money and they're out there hoping for the big bang to buy the lottery tickets. And you know, those countries, they think imported products are higher quality than products made in their own country. And on, and on, and on. Just look at this figure, if you will. We have been exposed to so-called free trade dogma for over 20 years now. They keep saying it'll work out all well for America. It'll work okay, American workers. What have we had for 20 years? Record trade deficits, which means record exporting of jobs. How? What's the latest nostrum by the free trade dogmatists? GATT and NAFTA, designed to envelop our democratic processes underneath an autocratic governance system with headquarters in Geneva, with secret tribunals, closed harmonization committees, equivalence procedures, and all the mumbo-jumbo that spells three things. One, that under GATT, the nations that treat their people more humanely are the ones who get in trouble. The countries who treat their people inhumanely are the ones that don't get in trouble. Because if we have strong consumer, workplace, and environmental standards, other countries can say, those are really indirect trade barriers. They're keeping out pesticide-laden food from Brazil or unsafe automobiles from the European community. And they take us to Geneva, and if we lose, we have to repeal these safety and health laws or pay tribute economic fines for these countries before secret tribunals that are closed to the public and have no independent appeal. Can you imagine suppressing our democratic processes by these kinds of autocratic systems of government? And harmonization, you know what that is? That means we'll never be first in health and safety standards because we have to meet in closed doors with other signatory nations and figure out how many dolphins are going to die, how much reformulated gasoline is going to be allowed, what kind of safety devices on our cars are going to be permitted. Lowest common denominator harmonization. Meat and poultry inspection harmonization meetings are going on now under GATT. This is a subversion of the progress that we've made and a chilling of future progress. Those of you who want to have stronger cancer prevention standards applied to industry, next time you propose them, you may well get a letter from the State Department saying, well, we respect your indulgence here, but don't waste your time. This proposal is GATT illegal. Do you know that we ban child labor in this country, but if we pass a law in Congress that bans the importation of products manufactured by brutalized child labor in other countries, that we will be defeated before the tribunal of the World Trade Organization, and we will have to repeal that law or pay tribute economic fines perpetually to the countries such as India or Bangladesh or others who are allowing this kind of tens of millions of children to be so horribly exploited? We're losing our sovereignty. Now, notice what happens when the GMP goes up in the aggregate and the yardsticks show growth, but it's declined for more and more of the American people. What happens is people start fighting people. The big guys at the top begin dividing and ruling. And middle class is told, hey, it's those poor people on welfare. Why, they're eating your taxes alive. Have you ever heard of these big guys at the top say, hey, it's those rich guys on welfare. They're really eating you out of house and home. You know, it's amazing. One sign of propaganda is devoid of fact because it's full of lies. And here's the propaganda. If you ask the average citizen in this country, what % of federal outlays goes to means-tested poverty entitlement programs? You know, that's food stamps, AFDC, child support, child nutrition, school lunches. I doubt whether many of them would say 3.4% of entire federal outlays. Now, when you ask them, how much do you think goes for corporate welfare? Well, suddenly there's a lack of statistics. But even the Wall Street Journal estimated it $140 billion a year. $140 billion a year. But if you take corporate welfare in terms of subsidies, bailouts, giveaways, inflated government contracts, tax loopholes of the grossest sort, and forgiveness of corporate debt, you're up to over $200 billion a year, easily. And yet, when the citizen groups go up to Congress and say, please, can we have $50 million more for safe drinking water systems in America? Sorry, no money. Can we have $300 million for equal justice under law called legal services of the poor? Oh, no, we can't afford it. Can we have $300 million for public broadcasting, little wholesome programming for children instead of the violence they see on TV? Oh, no, no, no. Got to balance the budget. They say, well, what about? Yet this is the same Congress that funded billions of dollars for the biggest mass transit program back a few years in our country. You know what it was? The MX missile. This is the same that pumps billions of dollars into antiquated or redundant or unnecessary mass weapon systems. I mean, just imagine the grotesque allocation of the federal budget. If the family allocated its budget the way the federal government under corporate power allocates its budget, the family would be committed. What if an average family spent 20% of its budget against a non-existent enemy? Another 15% of its budget to make the people living in the mansions on the Hill richer, and then wrung its hands when it came down to feeding the children, to providing them with health care, to providing them with a decent education, clothing, and housing. Our federal budget has enormous money that is being misused and wasted and escalated up from the middle class to the rich and the corporate, which can be used to produce millions of jobs in public works and building, rebuilding, repairing America. Notice. Okay. Go we go, 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 go we go. For those Americans who stay home and don't vote because of their disgust with Tweedledum, Tweedledee corrupt politics, I say your slogan should be, we're not staying home anymore. Because we don't have to stay home anymore. Because we can vote green for a change. Go we go, go we go, go we go, go we go. Okay. Let me say a few words on how these corporations are dismantling our democracy, because this has not been that visible in contemporary press reports. Giant corporations are on a collision course with American democracy, and American democracy is losing, and people are paying the penalties every day as they lose control over their future. Let me give you an illustration. Corporations now pretty much control legislatures, and they pretty much control those so-called wimpy regulatory agencies. What they don't fully control are our courts. And so there's a massive drive called tort reform, which is better known as tort deform, which is designed to protect perpetrators of wrongdoing, the corporations who produce unsafe pharmaceuticals, flammable fabrics, defective cars, from the people that they injure or kill, or whose property they destroy. And they are doing it with a massive propaganda drive that even Goebbels would be envious. For example, they are not concerned that 9 out of 10 wrongfully injured Americans never file a lawsuit because it's so difficult to go up against an Exxon or a DuPont or a Union Carbide or a General Motors with all of their ability and their law firms to delay and to overexpense and to hide the evidence. And they're not worried about opening the civil justice system for the 9 out of 10. They're going after the 1 out of 10 who's managed to surmount the obstacles to have his or her day in court. Now look how they're lying. They're saying that this litigiousness has reached record levels. Let me tell you, the University of Wisconsin Law School studies, the best in the business on this issue, we had more civil suits filed per capita in America in 1830 and 1840 and on the 1640 Virginia plantation. And the reason why was it was easier and less expensive, but it was a great privilege. These are the people coming off of King George III and predecessor tyrants. On that list of protests to King George III our forebears put number 2 on the list, that he was trying to deprive them of their right to trial by jury. This common law of tort law has been built up over 200 years. And the problem is not that it's overused, the problem is it's too little used. Of all the death and injury and disease caused by toxics and unsafe products and the negligence of these perpetrators, in any recent year, you know how much all these injured people and their next of kin receive by way of verdicts and settlements in state and federal courts in both product defect and medical malpractice? $7 billion. Now let me put that in perspective. We spend $7 billion in this country on dog and cat food, not counting gourmet dog and cat food. General Motors made $6.5 billion last year after taxes. General Motors and Chrysler made more in profit than the entire payout to these unfortunate 1 out of 10 people who get any justice in these courts, and they want to restrict it further. Medical malpractice is one of the leading forms of preventable violence in this country. A conservative estimate by the physicians at the Harvard School of Public Health say that in any given year, 80,000 people die in hospitals from malpractice, just in hospitals, not in clinics. That is more lost lives than the combined fatalities of motor vehicle deaths, homicides, and death by fire in the United States. And that doesn't count the injuries. And that generates $60 billion a year in lost economies. $60 billion. And guess what? The corporations are on Capitol Hill trying to restrict the rights of victims of malpractice from having their full day in court, to hold their perpetrators responsible. And one of their ways is to make sure that the brain-damaged infant, the teenager who'll never walk again, the housewife who's a paraplegic, or the worker who's a quadriplegic, and all of them have happened from medical malpractice, that they cannot collect more than $250,000 for a lifetime of pain and suffering, no matter what the judge and the jury think they are entitled to. Now, to show you the inequity that even exceeds medieval comparisons, one of the executives of one of the insurance companies pushing for these kinds of reforms is the head of the AIG insurance company, which pumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into the Republican convention a few days ago. I looked up what he made in 1994. This man wants a $250,000 cap, non-inflation adjusted, spread out over a 50-year life expectancy for a brain-damaged infant from medical malpractice. He was making $250,000 a week, every week, with no pain and suffering. And the top CEOs of the Fortune 300 companies, they're making 180 times the entry-level wage. You know what it was in 1940? 12. You know what it was in 1980? 45. You know what it was in 1990? 140. It's now over 180. You think things are getting a little difficult, aren't they? And this is what is continuing. Now, the dismantling of our democracy is not just the civil justice system. Millions of Americans are told, sign on the dotted line, whether it's a bank, an installment loan contract, a home mortgage, whether it's almost any contract you sign now. And in that, in the fine print's compulsory arbitration in case there's any dispute. That means you've signed away your rights to go to court. That means you've lost your bargaining power, your negotiating power. And that means even if you don't know that that is what you signed on the dotted line for, the pressure to exploit the consumers and workers increases. You don't see much of that on talk shows, I'll tell you. HMOs do this to people. The Bank of America does it, compulsory arbitration. And it's going on, and increasingly, in the workplace. So a woman in Texas who found that she was discriminated against, sexual harassment, she was ready to sue. The employer said, you signed this employment agreement, give up your right to sue. It's in fine print. Here's a magnifying glass. Do you realize that the two pillars of the American legal system are the law of torts and the law of contracts, and we are being deprived of the use of these laws by this dismantling of our legal system on the installment plan? And you begin to wonder why you're charged by credit card companies with impunity, by banks with impunity. The banks charge you for everything but breathing. Now, we come to the corporation itself. It's important to recognize that the corporation is a creature of government. Government charters the corporation. And so concerned were our forebears with this Frankenstein potential emerging, this artificial legal entity having power against defenseless human beings, that they required in the early 19th century legislative chartering of a corporation. Corporation wanted to produce textiles, they had to go to the legislature and get chartered. All you can do is just manufacture textiles. You got to be renewed after a few years. There was great suspicion of corporations early on, and for good reason. And then about 1886, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled, without hearing any arguments, that the corporation was a person. It was a person. You know these corporations. Don't you know they're always persons, don't you? I mean, you know HMOs are suffering from attention deficit disorder. Don't you know that drug companies are admitted kleptomaniacs? What this means is that for a century now, corporations have been getting all the rights that we human beings have, and an avalanche of privileges and immunities that we don't have. How can you have equal justice under the law in such circumstances? Now, let me give you a few illustrations. Corporations can create their own parents. They're called holding companies for evasive maneuvers. Corporations can transfer costs in ways you can't. When General Electric and Allis-Chalmers and Westinghouse were caught red-handed fixing prices for heavy-duty turbines in the early 1960s and sold them overcharged as a result to the electric utilities, the utilities countersued, the Justice Department prosecuted for once, and some of these executives went to jail for 6 weeks. This is a multi-billion-dollar theft. The judge himself described it as such. And after they left 6 weeks, they said goodbye to the fellow in the cell block near him who was in jail for 5 years for forging a $300 check. And here's what happened. The electric utilities got a multi-billion-dollar settlement. They had to pay him back. The electric manufacturing price conspirators got a ruling from the Treasury Department saying that all these payouts were ordinary and necessary business expenses and deductible on their corporate income tax. Well, if you get a traffic fine, can you, hey, what about this? Can we deduct this?